Hi there, and welcome to this video where I'll be talking you through a guide on how to ace your Oxford or Cambridge interview. So starting with the basics, when are interviews? Now this can vary from year to year, and it also varies depending on what subject you're applying for. As a general rule, Oxford and Cambridge interviews take place sometime in early to mid-December. In terms of when you'll be invited to an interview, this may only be a week or so before the interview actually takes place. So in terms of your preparation, it might be a good idea to start thinking about that before you get the invite, as you aren't left with lots of time once you've received that in order to prepare for the interview. So what will the interviews be like? Well, an interview at Oxford or Cambridge is not like a job interview you might have had or anything like that. It's more of an academic discussion between yourself and probably 2 or 3 academic tutors from the college you're applying to who are associated with the subject you're applying to. They might ask you some questions about yourself and about why you chose the subject, but the really important part of the interview is this academic discussion that you're going to have. So this will be based maybe on some reading you did before the interview. Potentially they might give you something to read in the interview itself, and you'll have a discussion formed around that, and the content of that discussion will obviously depend on your subject. There's no set way for how an Oxford or Cambridge interview will go. The 2 universities will do them differently, and then within each university, each college will have its own way of conducting interviews within each subject. So there's a lot of variability there. The common thread is this idea of an academic discussion. The location of your interview might also vary a bit depending on where you've applied. So for most people, your interview this year will be online as a video call. This is true for all of the colleges at Oxford, and it's also true for every college at Cambridge except for Trinity College, who are running interviews in person for applicants with home fees status this year. So international applicants to Trinity College, Cambridge will still be interviewed virtually, but if you live in the UK, you might be invited to an in-person interview. All these details will be communicated to you when you get that invite to interview, so don't worry about it just yet. It's also likely that you'll have more than one interview. Potentially you might be interviewed by 2 or 3 colleges, and if you're applying for joint honours, you might have several interviews for each of the subjects that you're applying for. You may also find you have additional interviews after the ones that you were already scheduled to have taken place. All of this is completely standard for Oxford and Cambridge interviews, and all this information will again be communicated to you if you do get invited to interview, so don't worry about any of that. So who gets invited to interview? Well, not every applicant will be interviewed. Applicants get shortlisted for interview based on the strength of their UCAS application, which you should have already submitted for 2022. Cambridge tend to interview more people than Oxford do. So Cambridge say they interview around 75% of home applicants, whereas Oxford say they interview around 10,000 applicants from the over 22,000 who apply each year. However, it varies from year to year, and these are obviously only rough estimates. So now we understand the basics of the Oxbridge interview, let's take a look at 10 top tips on how you can do as well as you can. Tip number 1 is to stay calm. This might seem difficult because an interview is a really daunting experience, but staying calm will help you come up with clearer answers and feel more confident. If you're not feeling super calm to begin with, the best way to deal with this is simply fake it till you make it. Act like you're really confident, and you'll probably feel more confident than if you let the nerves win and go in and put across a very nervous front. So pretend like you haven't got a care in the world, even if inside it's a really scary time. You should also make sure you've done as much as you can to alleviate any stress on the day. So if you have to go to your interview in person, make sure you're happy with all your travel plans. And if you're doing your interview online, make sure you've got somewhere to do it and you know that all the tech works in advance, so you won't have any stress on the day itself related to any of those logistical things. Tip number 2 is to reread your personal statement. Now, it might not happen in every interview, but it's possible that you'll be asked a question based on something in your personal statement. And this will normally be a kind of icebreaker question to get you into the swing of the interview. So you want to make sure you definitely have an answer for it to get off to a strong start. Make sure you know about what's in your personal statement and you can talk about what you've learned from it. You might want to have a quick reread of anything that you might have forgotten, and also think about if there's anything you've done since that can build on the things you talked about in your personal statement, as that might be really interesting to bring up too and show how engaged you are with your subject. Tip number 3 is don't worry about what you wear. It might seem like for something as big as an Oxford interview or a Cambridge interview you should be wearing a suit or something really formal, but that's absolutely not the case. You can wear basically whatever you want. Wear what makes you feel comfortable and ready to do your best. So for some people that might be wearing a suit, and for other people that might just be wearing a comfy jumper. It really doesn't matter. Tip number 4 is to practice talking to other people about your subject that you're applying to. This is one of the key skills that you'll need for the interview, as you need to be able to explain your thought processes and argue and give reasons about things related to your subject. So you want to practice this whenever you can. You could, for example, ask a teacher if they'd be willing to run a mock interview with you. Lots of mock interview questions can be found online and you could build a discussion around that. But it doesn't even need to be a teacher. If you've got friends who might be studying the same subject, applying to that subject at Oxbridge or at other universities, having discussions with them about the work you're doing in class or things you've read that you're interested in is also really useful. And you could even talk at a pet, for example. Anything that gets you talking about your subject is a good practice for this. So it doesn't need to be a fancy mock interview. It could just be you chatting to your dog about your favourite topics in English. It doesn't matter as long as you're talking. Tip number 5 is to try and find recordings of mock interviews to get an idea of what will be expected of you. You'll be able to find these on YouTube. There are some that have been published by Oxford and Cambridge. There are also examples potentially made by past tutors or by tutoring companies like Oxbridge Mind. We've got some mock interviews coming up, so stay tuned for those. Watching mock interviews that are relevant to your subject will give you a kind of idea of what questions you might get and what kind of reasoning is expected of you. Obviously, every interview is different, so it's not going to tell you exactly what's going to happen, but it's going to give you an idea of how things might go, which might help calm some nerves on the day and also help you to guide your preparation. You can also have a think about the interviews you watch. Have a think about that student's performance. What do you think they did well? Where do you think they could improve? And then apply that to how you might answer questions about your subject. Tip number 6 is don't be afraid to make mistakes. Mistakes are how you learn, and part of the Oxbridge interview is assessing your learning process. So if you do make a mistake, it's an opportunity to show that you can reassess your work, come back to it and get it right the second time. I made a mistake in my interview in some very basic maths, and all that happened was I had another look at it, I saw where I went wrong, corrected the mistake, we moved on as normal, and a couple of months later I got an offer. So mistakes are not the end of the world, and you can use them as an opportunity to show you can be flexible in your thinking, take another look at your work and make things right. Tip number 7 is to review any relevant material. Now, Oxbridge interviews don't tend to be a test of knowledge per se, because they might already have that information. For example, they know you are on track to do very well in your A-levels or might have already achieved some great A-level results or equivalent qualifications. They might have done an admissions assessment, they've seen your scores on there as well, so they're kind of aware already you probably have the knowledge required to study the degree. The interview is more of a test of how you learn and how you might apply that knowledge. However, if you are applying that knowledge, you need to have it in the first place. So make sure you do review any content that you've covered in your A-levels or your equivalent qualifications that might be relevant to the subject you're applying for, because they might assume some knowledge based on what you've studied, and you'll be much more confident if you have that knowledge secure already. It's also important to note you won't be expected to know things that you haven't had the chance to study. So if something does come up and you've got absolutely no idea what they're talking about, it might be worth just mentioning that to the interviewer and seeing if they can adapt the question or explain to you a concept you've not come across in order to answer it. So don't worry about that. Tip number 8 is try to enjoy it. It might not seem like something you'd enjoy because it's a very stressful time, but it can also be a really interesting time. It's an achievement in itself to get invited to interview, first of all, and that's something you should be proud of. It's also a really great opportunity to discuss a subject you're really passionate about with the experts in the field for that subject. So it's worth making the most of that opportunity in and of itself. I found my interviews really interesting and kind of an experience on their own, aside from the Oxbridge application things. If you let yourself enjoy it rather than convincing yourself you're going to have a terrible time, you probably are more likely to enjoy it. And if you're enjoying it, you're probably going to be more comfortable giving your answers and you're probably going to do better. Tip number 9 is to be open to discussion and to new ideas. Often in an interview, an interviewer might challenge a point you make or add some new information and ask you how that changes the situation. This is to assess how you might get on in an Oxbridge tutorial or supervision, where this kind of discussion is really how you learn in those kinds of teaching environments. So you need to be open to this discussion and be prepared to potentially change your ideas based on this new information. University isn't about taking things for granted as you learn them, it's about interrogating the material you're given and being critical. So showing you can do this in the Oxbridge interview is a really great way to show that you are ready for study at that level. And finally, tip number 10 is find some mock interview questions online and have a think about them. So you can find examples of mock interview questions on the internet. They tend to vary in quality, but any opportunity to think about your subject in that way is a useful one and you should take it. So you can find lists of interview questions either published by the university or potentially from past students online. Have a look at those and just have a think about how you'd answer it. What questions might come up as a result of what you've said, and consider those perspectives. And that way you'll have a practice at the kind of reasoning and thinking and answering that they're going to expect from you in the interview. So that's the end of our guide to the Oxbridge interview. Hopefully now you're feeling much more confident and ready to ace that interview. Thank you very much for watching.